Hi everyone, my name is Jack Dangermond, and for my final paper, I decided to read and analyze the 2016 book Ages of Discord by Peter Turchin. So this book analyzes socio-political instability in the United States using structural demographic theory. In this presentation, I'll be discussing this theory, as well as the future of heightened instability that it predicts. First of all, what is socio-political instability? Well, according to Turchin, it's violent group-level conflict within a state, somewhere between interpersonal violence and interstate warfare. It's probably easier to think about in terms of its physical manifestation, political violence. Examples of political violence include violent riots, lynchings, acts of terrorism, assassinations, and indiscriminate mass murders. Times of high socio-political instability correspond to times with greater frequency and severity of political violence events. With this definition in mind, it's worth asking, what leads to instability? And if we can answer this, are we able to predict future instability? According to structural demographic theory, we can, at least to some extent. At its core, this theory describes a system of interactions between the state, its elites, its population, and instability. Each of these components has a number of dimensions which, if we are able to quantify them, can be used to build mathematical models for each subsystem, and thus the system as a whole. More importantly, though, structural demographic theory claims that, and I quote, "Chief causes of socio-political instability in order of importance are 1. Elite overproduction leading to intra-elite competition and conflict, 2. Popular immiseration resulting from falling living standards, and 3. The fiscal crisis of the state." Ages of Discord is aimed at applying this theory to the United States by quantifying and modeling socio-political instability throughout American history. So, if we've accepted that history can be quantified and modeled using structural demographic theory, then what does it tell us? First of all, it tells us that America has been through one full secular cycle, which is basically a fancy way of referring to a historical period beginning with relative peace and becoming increasingly unstable, typically ending in state collapse, revolution, or civil war. And according to Turchin's analysis, America's first secular cycle lasted from its founding until the Great Depression in the 1930s. This cycle, of course, includes the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865. We are now nearing the halfway mark of America's second secular cycle. So, what does this mean for us? In 2013, Turchin made the fairly generic prediction that we should expect many years of political turmoil, peaking in the 2020s. A few days before the 2016 election, he doubled down on this forecast, reasoning that it didn't matter which presidential candidate won, the structural conditions for instability would likely remain. This past year, in an interview for The Atlantic, Turchin's prediction is that we are almost guaranteed 5 hellish years, and likely a decade or more. This is still fairly generic. Turchin isn't predicting any specific outcome, but more frequent and severe political violence is certainly in his forecast. So, as we discussed early on in this course, numbers aren't always as scientific or certain as they might appear. I think this is especially true when we're trying to model something as complex as the rise and fall of societies, which leads me to a few criticisms that I have of this model for the future. The first critique I have of Turchin's work is both the quantity and the reasonableness of assumptions that he makes. Of course, it's necessary to make some assumptions to model political instability, but I question whether these assumptions are legitimate. An example of this can be found right at the core of the model. Turchin came up with the Political Stress Index, or PSI, as a measurement of pressure for instability. PSI combines 3 other models representing the population, the elite, and the state. To quote Turchin's justification for how these subsystems come together, "I assume that these 3 components are combined in the index multiplicatively." Given that this calculation gives us our main metric for quantifying conditions for socio-political instability, this seems like a big assumption to make. Another critique I have is Turchin's use of proxies. Some of the inputs to his models are readily available, such as GDP or state debt. There are many others, however, that are not, so Turchin relies on proxies to try to represent them. Perhaps the most egregious example is Turchin's use of proxies to quantify the cultural forces affecting real wages. He begins by looking at the usage of the phrases cooperation, labor-business cooperation, and corporate greed in literature, but ultimately decides to use the real federal minimum wage as a proxy. There's also the issue that proxies necessarily change over time. For example, if we are trying to measure the number of elites and therefore intra-elite competition in a society, we first need to define what constitutes elite status. Turchin decides that, in America, the number of law and business students is a good proxy for this. It's pretty easy to argue that this wasn't a good proxy in the early days of America, when formal education in business and law didn't even exist. It's also easy to argue that this may not even be a good proxy now, given the very high-profile examples of tech elites that don't hold either of these degrees. So, is structural demographic theory a useful way to predict socio-political instability? Well, despite my critiques, my gut feeling is that SDT has some merit. Perhaps the biggest reason is because this theory doesn't claim to be able to predict that much. Let's look back at Peter Turchin's forecast. We should expect many years of political turmoil, peaking in the 2020s. While this is certainly a bold statement, it's very nonspecific about what we should expect. What exactly does political turmoil look like? Violent riots? Mass murders? Civil war? Because structural demographic theory is only meant to track and forecast conditions for instability, it doesn't have to predict anything specific to be proven right. Specific events of political violence can be triggered by a whole myriad of things, and are therefore very difficult to predict, even in the near future. It's worth pointing out that the January 6th Capitol insurrection fits squarely into Turchin's forecast, giving it, at least in my mind, a bit more weight. When analyzing Turchin's theory, it's also useful to look at how consistent it is to some of the science fiction we've read in this class. For one, it's clear that Parable of the Sower takes place during a particularly unstable time in America, one that I'd consider to be a version of societal collapse. Everything is present here: climate crisis, enormous amounts of inequality, arson, and violent murder. Oddly enough, this takes place during the 2020s, the exact decade that Turchin predicts political violence will escalate. There isn't any reason to believe this is anything but a coincidence, but it's still eerie. Some elements of structural demographic theory can be seen in Parable of the Sower. Perhaps the most glaring is that there is an oversupply of labor, which has led to either low wages or no wages, as well as popular immiseration. It's also clear that the state lacks either the resources or willpower to resolve this immiseration, or else it would be doing more to help its citizens. The element of SDT that is not clear, however, is elite overproduction and inter-elite competition. The tidbits we do get about President Donner suggest that there may have been a good deal of conflict among political elites, but it's hard to say. I'd also like to touch on the Gurkha and the Lord of Tuesday, because this takes place in a future where socio-political instability is almost entirely absent. In fact, karma ensures that this is the case. Through the lens of structural demographic theory, it's not surprising that political violence is virtually impossible in Kathmandu. It's not really possible to have an oversupply of labor, because labor isn't even necessary to achieve a decent standard of living. It's also not really possible to have elite overproduction, because karma can ensure that a balance of elites to commoners is maintained. And if anything starts to get out of control, the state, aka karma, is able to respond in near instant time. Of course, the power of karma is ultimately threatened, but only by a jinn with supernatural powers. Up until this moment, conditions are consistent with structural demographic theory's model of a stable time. So, where does that leave us? Structural demographic theory is certainly fascinating, and if Turchin's forecast is correct, America is in for quite the decade ahead. This forecast is very nonspecific, however, so we should look to the futures presented in science fiction to see what periods of instability might actually look and feel like. As to whether or not Turchin's theory will hold, only time will tell. Thank you so much for watching this presentation, and I look forward to seeing your questions on the discussion board. Thank you.